partly because a portion of the Eifel lay in the projected zone of advance of the Third Army, and partly because airfields of the reconnaissance group of the 19th Tactical Air Command, which supported the Third Army, were better situated than those of the 99th Tactical Air Command's reconnaissance group for missions over the Eifel. The commander of the Third Army, Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr., gained approval for pilots of the 10th Tactical Reconnaissance Group to include the Eifel in their coverage. The reports of that group were thus added to the accumulated knowledge of what was going on in the Eifel, as were the reports of the pilots of fighter bombers flying attack missions and those of 2 available night fighter squadrons, although neither of those squadrons had more than 10 P-61 night fighters, so that their contribution was limited. At Corps and Army headquarters, there were signal radio intelligence companies that constantly monitored the enemy's voice radio communications, usually at division level and below. By that monitoring or by radio directional finding, the companies often picked up the shift of German divisions. Yet German radio security was in general excellent, and those companies discerned absolutely no indication of what was about to happen in the Ardennes. Yet another source of operational intelligence was the front line itself, where outposts day after day looked across at the enemy, and where patrols almost every night probed the line. Many an American soldier who gazed out on the Eifel in those days would later recall reports he had submitted that, in his opinion, should have told his superiors that something was afoot, but in most cases he was unaware of the various sieves the information he provided had to pass through. Before ever reaching the First Army, the word he passed back went through S2S at battalion and regiment, and G2S at division and corps. Each in his turn evaluated the message, reflecting in the process his own preconceptions, his own appreciation of the enemy situation, so that in the end, many a frontline soldier's report failed to go much beyond the regimental level, and when it did, it might be deflated by an S2S or a G2S observation about it. When on December 12th, for example, a frontline regiment reported hearing tanks, the division G2 noted no confirmation, may have been tracked vehicles. At the optimum, operational intelligence worked in 2 ways up and down. Subordinate units passed up such information as they gleaned and deemed important, while G2S at higher commands passed information back down, in the process taking advantage of their broader knowledge as evaluated and correlated from more diverse sources. One of those sources was strategic intelligence, and in that field the Allied command had a special capability. A sonnet written by a machine, wrote a brilliant young British mathematician, Alan Matheson Turing, will be better appreciated by another machine. Turing was a person with the unpredictable waywardness of genius. He once changed all his money into silver, melted it down into ingots, buried them, and never could recall where he had left them. As war came to Europe in 1939, young Turing, a graduate of Cambridge University and of the Institute of Advanced Studies at Princeton University, was a member of a team made up primarily of Cambridge Dons, assembled for the specific purpose of attacking the German enciphering machine, the Enigma. The Dons proceeded on a variation of Turing's theory of the sonnet: a riddle created by a machine can best be solved by another machine. Turing and his colleagues worked under the cover of a technically non-existent government code and cipher school. It was based in a modest, though architecturally flamboyant pseudo-Tudor Gothic mansion known as Bletchley Park, located in Buckinghamshire, outside the grimy railway junction town of Bletchley, some 50 miles northwest of London. Most of the work took place in Hut 6, one of several temporary wooden buildings erected on the grounds of the estate. The work at Hut 6 received strong assistance from Polish cryptanalysts, who in the years before the war had enjoyed a modest success in breaking some of the ciphers of the early Enigma machines by means of a machine they called the Bomber, a combination of 6 Enigmas joined together. As war neared, the Poles turned over both to the British and to the French a Polish-constructed copy of the Enigma, along with plans and drawings of the Bomber. By the spring of 1940, Turing and his colleagues had built the first of what was destined to be a series of ever more complex machines designed to attack the Enigma. It was a large copper-coloured cupboard about 6 feet tall, which on first glance looked like an oriental goddess. They called it the Mark I Heath Robinson, after a satirical British cartoonist who drew weird, fanciful machines supposedly capable of extraordinary feats, but they usually referred to it by the original Polish name, the bomber. It was a forerunner of the computer, yet not a true computer, for it worked on electromechanical rather than electronic principles and had no memory. Once wireless interceptors picked up an enemy signal, it was copied onto a tape and fed into the bomb, which proceeded at a speed far beyond that of the human mind to determine which of the more than 1 million keys or variations of them had been used to encipher the message. For all the miraculous ability of the bomber, it had to have extensive human help. That was where the cryptanalysts came in, for through long months of working with Enigma intercepts and creating a vast databank of intercepted signals, they had discerned certain patterns in the transmissions. They had early learned, for example, that the letter punched by the operator never showed up in the encoded message, as the same letter, thus X or Y or whatever, could represent only one of 25 letters, not one of 26. They had also learned to capitalize on the laxity of the German operators, many of whom, after setting the machine and closing it, selected as the day's key the 3 letters that were visible in windows on the lid, and the operators dutifully repeated the key at the start of every message they transmitted. Constant repetition of the key could in time mean something in regard to the overall code. Over a long period of time, the cryptanalysts became familiar with the various headquarters making the transmissions, thereby ascertaining the call sign of the sender and usually the call sign of the recipient, for the traffic between the various headquarters was fairly constant. By directional radio finding, they could also determine the geographical location of both sender and recipient. Even though call signs changed daily, the German operator had only so many for his own headquarters, and for those with which he communicated, so that in time the cryptanalysts could develop a catalogue of call signs and geographical locations for various headquarters. So, the cryptanalysts could capitalize on the fact that military units were usually required to transmit situation reports at much the same time each day, and those usually contained standard opening phrases such as morning report from 7th Army or evening report from Fliegerkorps 2. From the hour of transmission and from the standard phrases, the cryptanalysts might determine the code letters used that day for the hour and the standard phrase. By feeding all those clues and more into the bomb, the cryptanalysts usually provided enough information for the amazing machine to turn the clues swiftly into a break of the day code. From that point, it was simple for the bomb to decipher all intercepted signals enciphered in that particular code. Wireless intercept stations in various parts of Britain fed one signal after another to Bletchley Park, literally thousands every day. They went to Hut 6, where the bomb deciphered them. Then messengers passed them to one of 2 other huts if Army or Air Force messages, to Hut 3 if naval intercepts, to Hut 5. The material that emerged from those 2 huts as translated and interpreted messages was known by the codename Ultra. A staff of more than 100 manned each hut, working in shifts around the clock, filling in missing letters or words, translating the messages, and from a vast collection of data recorded on index cards, providing interpretation of the message, which, to differentiate the interpretation from the message, was always carefully labelled comment. Many of the people who did the work were in uniform, but most who filled in the letters and words and did the translating were civilian dons, highly proficient in German, and accustomed to the painstakingly slow functioning of the pedagogue. Beginning in 1942, Americans joined the staff, most of them lawyers in uniform. By late 1944, deciphered, reconstructed and translated messages, re-enciphered in Allied codes and known as flimsies, were going in abundance from Hut 3 directly over special communications links to more than 50 Allied air and ground headquarters, including Eisenhower's SHAEF, all 3 army groups under Eisenhower's command, all army headquarters, and all major air commands, down to and including tactical air commands. There, the information was received by small sections known as Special Liaison Units, or SLUs, which in British practice usually consisted of an officer and 2 or 3 men, but which in American practice were usually slightly larger. The number of people within the headquarters privy to the Ultra material, indeed, to the very fact that there was such a thing as Ultra, was sharply limited, usually to the commanding general, his chief of staff, and his G2. Information provided by Ultra was not to be reported in G2 summaries, periodic reports or intelligence estimates, unless it could be truthfully ascribed to some other source. A specially designated officer in Hut 3 determined which headquarters got which flimsy, but that was usually a decision involving only major commands, such as SHAEF or the Allied Command in Italy. Which headquarters got what appeared in code letters at the top of the flimsy for the 12th Army Group, for example, WM for the 1st Army, YK, and the list of code letters was usually long, for if it was considered to be of interest to Eisenhower's headquarters, it was considered to be of interest to all commands under Eisenhower. The volume of flimsies reaching an SLU was large but seldom overwhelming, and Bletchley Park provided an indication of a flimsy's importance by assigning it a number of Zs from 1 to 5. Although the identification or location of enemy units as obtained through Ultra might be posted on a special situation map maintained by the SLU, a flimsy had to be destroyed within 24 hours of receipt. Heads of the SLUs were nevertheless permitted to make notes so long as they bore no identifiable relation to the original source material. That provided at least a modicum of institutional memory, as did the comments often provided with a message by Bletchley Park. Since all commanders receiving Ultra information knew that the data came from the enemy's own messages, none was inclined to discount it. Ultra had, after all, given fairly explicit warning of the enemy's counterattack in Normandy, designed to cut off Allied spearheads that had broken out of the beachhead. In most headquarters, procedures for passing Ultra information to the commander were much the same. Each morning, the head of the SLU or his representative briefed the commander and senior members of his staff, along with the comparable air commander. Commanders and all of the few other officers cleared for Ultra were free to visit the Ultra room at any time, and whenever a message came in labelled with 5 Zs, the head of the SLU had to take it personally to the commander, no matter what time of day or night. The only exception to those procedures was at headquarters of the 1st Army, where the G2, Colonel Dixon, insisted on presenting the Ultra briefing himself, a briefing from which he excluded the head of his SLU, Lieutenant Colonel Adolf G. Rosengarten, Jr. For a time, Dixon merely employed the raw messages, but in the weeks before the start of the German offensive, he began to use a briefing paper prepared by Rosengarten. Although Dixon resisted having the Ultra officer from the 9th Tactical Air Command, Lieutenant Colonel James D. Fellers, attend, he had to bow to pressure from the commander of the 9th Tactical Air Command, Major General Elwood R. Quesada. As the German army fell back on the frontier in early fall, the volume of wireless traffic decreased, for there the telephone took over many of the chores of communication. Yet Hitler's order forbidding transmission by wireless of any information that might be connected with the impending offensive had little additional effect on the number of intercepted messages pouring into Bletchley Park. Certainly not enough of a reduction to indicate that anything untoward was afoot, for if day-to-day functions and operations were to continue, the German army, and particularly the Luftwaffe and the Reichsbahn, had to use wireless. So, wireless was a basic means of conveying the disinformation that the Germans wanted the Allies to hear. Thus, all that was really missing was any reference to an offensive in the Ardennes, and interceptors and cryptanalysts continued to handle around 50 messages a day dealing with the Western Front. What those messages had to tell Allied intelligence chiefs and their commanders in the weeks immediately preceding the German offensive was considerable. On September 27, 1944, Bletchley Park deciphered a message from operational headquarters of the Waffen-SS, dated September 18th, directing that all SS units on the Western Front be pulled from the line for rest and refitting, beginning with the 1st, 2D, 9th, and 12th SS Panzer Divisions, the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, 3 separate heavy tank battalions, and headquarters troops of the 1st SS Panzer Corps. All were to be assigned to the staff of 6th Panzer Army, the setting up of which has been ordered under Oberstgruppenführer Sepp Dietrich. That there was a 9-day delay between the sending of the German message and Bletchley Park's deciphering it was probably attributable to cryptographic difficulties, for a delay of that length was unusual. The deciphered message went out in late afternoon of the 27th to General Eisenhower's headquarters and all subordinate commands down to and including armies and tactical air commands. 4 days later, on October 1st, the SHAEF G2, General Strong, noted in his weekly intelligence summary that the Germans were withdrawing armour from the line in an apparent effort to provide a panzer reserve north of the Ardennes. Strong made no mention of specific divisions, nor of the 6th Panzer Army. Throughout October, Ultra provided further details about the withdrawals. In mid-October, for example, a message from Field Marshal Keitel revealed that the 6th Panzer Army was to be the OKW Reserve, which meant that neither Field Marshal Model nor Field Marshal von Rundstedt had control over it, was a strategic reserve for the Führerhauptquartier, Hitler's headquarters. Other messages located assembly areas for the divisions, mostly east of the Rhine in Westphalia, just north of the ROER, or dealt with the training areas where the divisions were to refit. Still others told of difficulties in releasing certain units from the line, noted altered withdrawal schedules, and revealed that the SS Panzer divisions were to be brought to full strength. A further message revealed that Hitler himself had ordered the withdrawals and the creation of the 6th Panzer Army. Yet another revealed a certain urgency. Headquarters of the 1st SS Panzer Corps was to join the 6th Panzer Army by October 20th at latest. Longer delays by Corps could not be permitted. Throughout the month, neither General Strong nor any other Allied intelligence officer in intelligence summaries, periodic reports, or estimates of enemy intentions made mention of the 6th Panzer Army. Strong first named it at the end of the first week in November, citing a German deserter as the source of the information, and at the same time Strong remarked that the 5th Panzer Army had disappeared from the line in Lorraine, which, unknown to Strong at the moment, was the first step in the move of General von Manteuffel's headquarters to the Aachen sector. What preoccupied Strong, Seibert Dixon, and the other intelligence chiefs was what the Germans intended to do with the SS Panzer divisions. Was it counterattack or spoiling attack? General Seibert at the 12th Army Group expressed the generally held view that it would be counterattack, to be launched once the 1st and 3rd US armies achieved a breakthrough toward the Rhine and the Ruhr. General Strong believed that whatever action the Germans took, it would occur in November, which was what the magic intercept of Baron Oshimus' report of his conversation with Hitler had indicated, an offensive in the West sometime after the beginning of November. Nobody mentioned that the SS Panzer divisions constituted as Ultra had reported not a reserve for Model or von Rundstedt, but for OKW, for Hitler. In early November, Ultra began to provide evidence of a hurried move of German fighter aircraft to the west. Beginning on the 8th, the Luftwaffe Command in the Netherlands sent the first of a series of messages dealing with the expected arrival of fighter groups at airfields in its sector. The messages displayed an air of haste and secrecy in regard to the special contingency known to you. On November 16th, in a message from a higher Luftwaffe command ordering daily reports on the serviceability of all aircraft, the sender used the term Jageraufmarsch, which the officials in Hut 3 considered to be worth a comment. In a military context, the comment read, Aufmarsch denoted the assembly of forces for a planned operation, a term which the Germans had used in that sense when describing the Allied dispositions on the eve of D-Day. Other messages meanwhile told of a build-up of fighter aircraft at fields inside Germany close to the front, and by November 23rd, it was clear that the hurried Jageraufmarsch, whatever it was for, was complete. Neither at Bletchley Park, nor at any Allied air or ground headquarters on the continent, did anybody divine the purpose behind the Jageraufmarsch. Years later, it would be clear that the haste reflected Hitler's original intention of launching his offensive before the end of November. But nobody on the Allied side could discern that at the time, nor even why the Germans moved the planes at all. In the new locations, the aircraft still might intercept Allied bombers raiding German cities, or they might support a German counterattack when the American armies broke through toward the Rhine. When the transfers produced no increase in the paltry amount of air support the German ground troops were receiving, support of the expected German counterattack appeared to be the answer. Nor did the fact that the bulk of the transfers ended on November 23rd provide any clue, and nobody saw any particular significance in a revelation by Ultra early in December of the creation of a new headquarters, Jagdführer Mittelrhein, although it was soon obvious from strength reports to that headquarters that it controlled the newly transferred aircraft. Any Allied attempt to determine the meaning of the shifts was all the more difficult, because in most cases, in keeping with Hitler's stringent security plan, the German commanders and operators who sent the messages Bletchley Park deciphered knew little or nothing of the purpose themselves. Starting in early November, troops of the 6th Panzer Army began to transfer to the west bank of the Rhine. Duly noting the moves, Allied intelligence officers began a guessing game as to the exact location of the assembly areas. The game was essentially meaningless, for all deduced that the assembly areas were in the vicinity of Cologne, a location from which the SS divisions might readily counterattack a thrust toward the Ruhr. Noting that the enemy had apparently created or rebuilt at least 5 SS Panzer or Panzer divisions and 5 parachute divisions during September and October, a truly colossal effort, General Strong at Schaeff concluded that the Germans intended a final showdown before the winter, and deemed it logical that they would use their newly created reserve against an Allied drive in the north. General Seibert at the 12th Army Group continued to think much the same, while Colonel Dixon at the 1st Army saw the possibility of a spoiling attack from positions northwest of Aachen to drive down both banks of the Meuse River, a maneuver not unlike the small solution proposed to Hitler by von Rundstedt and Model, although Dixon presupposed no accompanying drive through the Ardennes. By November 20, almost all were of one mind. The 6th Panzer Army's mission was to counterattack once the American armies crossed the ROER River, probably with the help of the 5th Panzer Army, whose arrival in the Aachen sector they had quickly spotted, for 3 divisions of that army were behind the ROER River, in a position to assist the 6th Panzer Army. It was a few days later before they picked up the bogus headquarters, Gruppe von Manteuffel, but when they did so, they saw through a part of the German deception by identifying the arrival of headquarters of the 15th Army. At that point, they concluded that von Manteuffel controlled 2 armies, the 5th Panzer and the 15th, and Ultra at least, learned that the 5th Panzer Army had moved out of the line. The German attempt through false wireless traffic to conceal the 15th Army's relief in the Netherlands by the 25th Army failed utterly. Meanwhile, Ultra was continuing to feed the intelligence officers a steady diet of intercepted messages, mainly dealing with troop movements by rail and related requests for air protection. In a message sent with high priority, Model's Army Group B in early November asked the Luftwaffe for fighter protection for the unloading of troop trains in the vicinity of Cologne. That was the first of more than 30 similar intercepted and decoded messages over the weeks remaining before the German attack, always originating with Army Group B. Although many requests were for protection in the north near Cologne, most were for the Rhine crossings between Bonn, just beyond the northern reaches of the Eifel, and for Koblenz, at the confluence of the Moselle River with the Rhine, whence the main rail line along the southern periphery of the Eifel ran along the Moselle to Trier. From any of those rail crossings of the Rhine, trains might use the spur lines into the Eifel, and in the last days before Hitler's deadline, most requests were for protection in the vicinity of Koblenz, well away from the sector in the north where Allied eyes were focused. At the same time, the Luftwaffe was ordering subordinate commands to fly counter-reconnaissance screens to keep Allied aircraft away from the marshalling yards at Koblenz and Trier. Of greater interest, many of the requests were for aerial protection of railheads inside the Eifel. On December 2nd, for example, Army Group B wanted fighter cover not only for Trier, but for Wittlich, Gerolstein, and Bitburg, all deep inside the Eifel. In a request for protection on December 3rd, Army Group B named the ground units involved in the movements, the 326th Volksgrenadier Division at Gerolstein, in the shadow of the Schnee Eifel, the 62D Volksgrenadier Division at Wittlich, due east of Bitburg, and a relatively short march from St. Vith, where that division attacked, and the Führer Begleit Brigade, an armoured brigade built around Hitler's Inner Palace Guard and never before employed at the front, at Kokum, on the main rail line along the Moselle. On December 7th, Army Group B wanted fighter cover for virtually the entire Eifel, and all the while, none of the planes providing cover either for the rail movements or the railheads came from those airfields so recently reinforced with additional fighter aircraft. With some exultancy, the cryptanalysts, with the help of their ingenious Turing engine, began early in November to break the codes of the Reichsbahn. Of some 800 trains used to move the German attack force into position, Ultra picked up signals on almost half, clearly indicating a massive movement toward the Western Front. On occasion, the messages revealed intense urgency on November 10th, about a week after the movements began, The Director General of Transport insisted that the 6th Panzer Army order all units to ensure punctual transport, for it would be impossible to make up any delays once they had occurred, because all formations already being moved at highest possible tempo. The day before, he noted with some agitation, the 2 DSS Panzer Division had fallen 36 hours behind schedule, the Panzer Lehr Division, 24, and the 12th SS Panzer Division, 12. Maintaining the tight schedules was clearly of major importance. Even a 12-hour delay was reason for concern. Even as Ultra was reporting rail movements and requests for their aerial protection, reconnaissance and fighter pilots of the 9th and 17th Tactical Air Commands were picking up many of the movements. Despite the bad weather that Hitler counted on and got, and despite the tendency of the pilots to concentrate on regions to the north where ground intelligence officers expected the enemy to strike, there was many an indication of build-up in the Eifel. In fairly clear weather on November 18th and 19, for example, pilots reported heavy rail movements at various points in the Eifel, at Gemund, near the ROER River dams, at Gerolstein, and at Bitburg. Marshalling yards at Koblenz and Trier were aswarm with activity. Pilots reported trains loaded with tanks, ambulances and other vehicles, hospital trains, troop trains. Sometimes there were truck convoys marked with white square panels in an apparent effort to simulate American convoys. A few pilots reported what looked to be piles of equipment alongside the roads just inside the tree lines. In the first 2 weeks of December, the weather proved even more restrictive, but there was continued evidence of build-up nevertheless. Many sightings were again in or near the Eifel, at Koblenz, Prüm, Gemund, Münstereifel, Gerolstein, Trier. Despite having only a few Black Widow planes each, the 2 American night reconnaissance squadrons also turned in considerable evidence of build-up, columns of what looked to be vehicles with dim-out lights, which would indicate truck convoys on many of the roads west of the Rhine, and in some places irregular patches of shielded lights away from the roads, which might indicate troop assembly areas. One pilot reported a battery of searchlights turned on briefly near Kaiserslautern, which was well south of the Moselle River in front of the Third Army, but it might have been noted only a few miles by rail from the Eifel. On November 24th, Ultra began to decipher what became a series of requests from Army Group B, some betraying an increasingly urgent note for aerial reconnaissance missions that, when viewed in the context of a German counterattack in the north near Cologne, made little sense. The first asked for reconnaissance of the region around Eupen and Malmedy, which was the most direct route from the Eifel to the American supply center of Liège, and for American reinforcements moving south into the Ardennes, and also of roads along the Prüm-Houffalize axis, which was one of the most direct routes via Saint-Vith into and through the Ardennes. On December 3rd, Army Group B again asked for reconnaissance of the area around Eupen and Malmedy, our force being brought up in Monschau area, and what forces, where are troop movements and concentrations and tank assemblies. Beginning on November 29th, there were odder requests still for aerial reconnaissance of crossings of the Meuse River from Liège past the bend in the river at Namur, and upstream for 55 miles past Dinant to Givet. A few days later, the Luftwaffe gave that assignment to a special detachment of jet aircraft, and night reconnaissance also began. Reconnaissance was to be forced through at lower level if weather prevents high-level flight. On December 3rd, a message said that reconnaissance of the bridges over the Meuse was of the greatest urgency. And 5 days later, on the 8th, a good photo of mass Meuse crossings from Maastricht to Givet, still with priority over other tasks. As late as December 14th, demands for those photos and for others of the road centre of Ciney, a few miles short of the Meuse, were still coming in. What could crossings of the Meuse River in the Ardennes, far from the German concentration near Cologne, have to do with a German counterattack near Cologne? Ultra revealed all those things, and more too. For every request for reconnaissance of the region around Eupen and Malmedy, there were at least 3 more for reconnaissance around Aachen, and repeated requests for aerial protection for trains unloading in the vicinity of Cologne. Reconnaissance pilots reporting rail movements and possible truck convoys in the Eifel were also reporting movements farther north that well might be deduced to feed a build-up near Cologne, and railheads and marshalling yards other than those in or close to the Eifel were also busy. So, too, on December 11th, Bletchley Park deciphered a message from Field Marshal von Rundstedt, large-scale attack against Western Germany might begin in very near future. Allies would probably try to seize Rhine crossings by air landings on large scale. Most important, therefore, that defence at Rhine bridges should be in constant state of readiness. Wehrkreis commanders to report by 18th whether all preparations for defence of Rhine crossings made. In response to concerns about the thinness of the front in the Ardennes, as expressed by the commander of the 8th Corps, Major General Troy H. Middleton, General Eisenhower and General Bradley visited Middleton on November 8th, lunched with him at his headquarters in a Belgian army caserne in Bastogne, then toured lower headquarters near the front. They left at the end of the day well aware of widely spaced positions, but since the Germans, like the Americans, appeared to be using the sector to give depleted divisions a rest and new ones a taste of combat experience, they entertained no real concern for what Bradley would later call a calculated risk. Besides, Bradley had already sent a newly arrived 9th Armoured Division to the Ardennes in October to serve Middleton as a reserve. One of Bradley's subordinates, the commander of the 3rd Army, General Patton, was less sanguine. On November 24th, he wrote in his diary that the 1st Army is making a terrible mistake in leaving the 8th Corps static, as it is highly probable that the Germans are building up east of them. That entry no doubt reflected a growing concern on the part of Patton's G2, Colonel Koch, he who had never been so optimistic about the condition of the German forces, as were his intelligence colleagues in other commands. Since the southern portion of the Eifel was an extension of the 3rd Army's projected zone of advance, Koch paid it special attention. It was at his suggestion that Patton had obtained approval for reconnaissance aircraft supporting the 3rd Army to reconnoitre over the Eifel. Koch was particularly concerned about the threat that would accrue to the 3rd Army's north flank should the Germans emerge from the Eifel into the Ardennes. By December 9th, he was sufficiently worried to invite his commander to a special intelligence briefing. As Koch put it to Patton, the enemy had at least 13 divisions out of the line, including 6 Panzer or SS Panzer divisions, and at least 4 parachute divisions. Koch had also learned, presumably from Ultra, that 3 divisions had left Scandinavia for the Western Front. Although most of the armour was in the north near Cologne, the 2 D Panzer and 12th SS Panzer divisions had recently been reported moving south. By Koch's reckoning, the enemy had 4 Volksgrenadier divisions in the line opposite the 1st Army's the 8th Corps, 2 Panzer divisions with a total of 105 tanks in immediate reserve, and 3 Volksgrenadier divisions nearby. Considering what the 8th Corps had in the line, the German concentration was greater, comparatively, than it was opposite the rest of the 1st Army or the 3rd Army. Koch concluded that the Germans intended either to shift the reserve forces in the Eifel north or south to meet American threats, to use them to try to lure American divisions away from the main attack, or to launch a spoiling or diversionary offensive. A short silence followed Koch's presentation, then discussion began. Nothing was to be allowed to interfere with the 3rd Army's plan for a renewed offensive on December 19th, Patton declared at the end, but the staff was to begin limited outline planning to meet any threat that might emerge from enemy action in the Ardennes. "We will be in a position," said Patton, "to meet whatever happens." The next day, December 10, Colonel Koch put his concern in writing. Strongly impressed by the withdrawal of German divisions from the line, particularly Panzer divisions, at a time when the enemy's defensive need was so great, he predicted that the Germans probably intended to mount a spoiling offensive in an effort to unhinge the Allied assault on Festung Deutschland. Yet 3 days later, he weakened his earlier warning about the Ardennes by falling into line with the view prevailing among his intelligence associates that the enemy was planning a counterattack with the 6th Panzer Army. At headquarters of the 1st Army, Colonel Dixon was also becoming concerned. One event that set him worrying was the capture in late November by troops of the 9th Army of an order issued on October 30th by the 86th Corps, which called on all units of the Corps to screen for men who had a knowledge of the English language and also the American dialect, and who might volunteer for a special unit the Führer had ordered for employment on reconnaissance and special tasks on the Western Front. The order also directed that captured US clothing, equipment, weapons and vehicles were to be collected as equipment of the above troops. Otto Skorzeny's fear that the Allies would obtain a copy of that order had come to pass. In several informal discussions with Dixon, the head of the First Army's SLU, Colonel Rosengarten, recalled the German offensive through the Ardennes in 1940 and noted that desperate men are likely to take desperate measures. Possibly as a result of those discussions, Dixon prevailed on his commander, General Hodges, to ask General Bradley for 2 divisions to back up the line in the Ardennes. No, said Bradley, he had none to spare. On December 8th, Monk Dixon presented to Hodges a map labelled Study of Enemy Armoured Reserves, on which the head of his G2 target section, Lieutenant Colonel Clarence M. Mendenhall, had tabulated German troop and armour concentrations, as well as stockpiles of ammunition and bridging equipment based on information gathered from all intelligence sources. Mendenhall had labelled each location priority red bomb, blue bomb, or brown bomb. Those labelled red and blue bombs were troop concentrations close to railheads or rail junctions through which troops and supplies were known to pass. Of a total of 53 targets, 29 were in the sector north of the Eifel, 26 of which were labelled red bomb in the Eifel, some as far back as the Rhine. There were 24, 10 of them labelled red bomb. Priority clearly was in the north. Convinced that Allied bombing of the enemy's railroads had been at random and never sufficiently concentrated to knock out all lines in a given area at once, Dixon wanted all the targets hit in a concentrated offensive by medium and heavy bombers. When General Hodges approved, as did the commander of his supporting Tactical Air Command, General Quesada, the request went forward to the commander of the United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, General Carl Spaatz, who controlled the heavy bombers. It came back disapproved targets unremunerative. By December 10th, Dixon had become convinced that the Germans were going to make a move somewhere soon. He was scheduled to go on a long-delayed 4-day leave to Paris the next day, and even though he had no concern about leaving his intelligence duties to the deft, sure hand of his deputy, Col William Silvey, he considered the German build-up so threatening that before departing, he wanted to convey a solemn warning. On the 10th, he issued G2 Estimate No. 37, on which he had worked at considerable length, a document he and others would later claim should have been sufficient to alert the Allied command to the offensive in the Ardennes. In the estimate, Dixon used the terms all-out counterattack and all-out counteroffensive interchangeably, although technically they are 2 different things. An extremely intelligent PW, he noted, stated that every means possible is being gathered for the coming all-out counteroffensive. Morale among recently captured prisoners of war had achieved a new high, as expressed by attempts to escape and avowed eagerness to rejoin the battle for Germany. With a jibe at Adolf Hitler, who often boasted of success in military operations based on his intuition, Dixon wrote that von Rundstedt, who obviously is conducting military operations without the benefit of intuition, has skillfully defended and husbanded his forces, and is preparing for his part in the all-out application of every weapon at the focal point and the correct time to achieve defense of the Reich west of the Rhine by inflicting as great a defeat on the Allies as possible. Among enemy capabilities, Dixon mentioned as current continuing to defend along the line of the Roer River with particular attention to the Roer River dams, which the enemy recognized as a tactical ace. When American troops crossed the Roer, a second capability would be likely, a concentrated counterattack with air, armor, infantry, and secret weapons at a selected focal point at a time of his own choosing. It was plain that the enemy's strategy was based on the exhaustion of our offensive, to be followed by an all-out counterattack with armor between the Roer and the Erft. The continual building up of forces to the west of the Rhine pointed consistently to his staking all on counteroffensive. The focal point, wrote Dixon, was between Roermond and Schleiden. Roermond, which lay within the sector of the 21st Army Group, is 22 miles north of Aachen. Schleiden is within the northern reaches of the Eifel near the Roer River dams, almost due east of Monschau. That placed the focal point well north of the Ardennes. To deduce from that prediction that Dixon anticipated an offensive out of the Eifel into the Ardennes would be to strain credulity. Although he noted that the enemy's armoured reserve appeared to be quartered in houses and barns along the railroads, generally in a semicircle from Dusseldorf to Koblenz, with Cologne as a centre point, his only specific reference to the Ardennes was to remark a definite pattern for the seasoning of newly formed divisions in the comparatively quiet sector opposite Eight Corps, prior to their dispatch to more active fronts. He did note the presence in backup positions in the Eifel of the 2D and 116th Panzer Divisions, but believed they were being readied to counterattack to deny the First Army capture of the ROER River dams, which may have been the reason he extended the likely sector for enemy action as far south as Schleiden. At General Bradley's headquarters, in a drab brownstone office building belonging to the Luxembourg State Railways, across a cobblestoned Place de Metz from the Luxembourg City Railroad Station, Edwin Siebert was also beginning to have some concern about the Ardennes. In late November, as he and General Bradley had driven through the region en route to visit Field Marshal Montgomery's headquarters in northern Belgium, they had both remarked the absence of troops and installations behind the lines. When they discussed the possibility of a German thrust through the Ardennes, Bradley said that when anyone attacks, he does it for one of two reasons. Either he is out to destroy the hostile forces, or he's going after a terrain objective. Neither, said Bradley, could be attained in the Ardennes. Yet even should the Germans attack there, it was hardly likely that they could make decisive progress through such broken, relatively roadless country. And if they tried, we could chew them up. Hardly had Bradley and Seibert returned to Luxembourg City when a disturbing ultra-intercept reached Seibert's desk. It was the first order to the Luftwaffe to reconnoitre crossings of the Meuse River from Liège to Givet, with reconnaissance to be forced through at lower level if weather prevents high-level flight. So concerned was Seibert that he sent his deputy, Col William H. Jackson, to Schaff and thence to London to visit the top British intelligence agencies to see if he could get any additional information. Jackson departed on December 1st, but soon cabled that he could find out nothing more. On December 10th, the terrain expert in Seibert's G2 section, Major Ralph Ingersoll in Civilian Life, a prominent newspaperman, asked Seibert to come to his office, where on a wall map he pointed out detraining areas in the vicinity of Bitburg. Instead of just moving inexperienced or recuperating divisions in and out of the Eifel, said Ingersoll, the Germans might be building up there by a stratagem of moving 3 divisions in and 2 out, while hiding the extra one. The theory impressed Seibert enough for him to relate it to General Bradley, who promptly asked the Supreme Commander, General Eisenhower, for a newly arriving armoured division as an additional reserve for the Ardennes, but Eisenhower said no. He needed the new division for reinforcing the 7th Army, to help it support renewal of the 3rd Army's offensive. Furthermore, there was some concern that if the Germans struck other than in the north, it might be in Alsace, where Allied lines were also thin, and such French cities as Metz and Nancy were within easy reach. For all the rising interest in the Ardennes, Seibert believed any threat there to be minimal compared to the build-up of German armour in the north near Cologne. Even on that score, Seibert thought that Monk-Dixon in his G2 estimate number 37 was exaggerating. Indeed, he found Dixon's latest assessment so pessimistic that when General Strong telephoned from Schaff to complain and to urge that Seibert get Dixon straightened out, Seibert agreed something should be done. Strong was also concerned about Monk's shrubbery, for Dixon had bolstered his pessimistic case by naming some German units identifiable only through ultra, and known in fact to be located on other fronts. Lacking either technical or command supervision over Dixon, Seibert chose to counter Dixon's alarm by issuing a more sober report himself. That he failed to telephone Dixon or to ask for a conference appeared to say something about the state of relations between the two. By chance, that was the point at which the G2 section, in response to criticism that its intelligence summaries were dull and therefore seldom read, chose to call in the newspaperman Ralph Ingersoll to dress them up. Ingersoll's first rewrite was of G2 summary numbered 18, which Seibert issued on December 12th, the summary in which Seibert remarked that attrition was eating heavily into German strength, and that the front was more brittle and vulnerable than it appeared on G2 maps or to troops in the line. The deathly weakness of the infantry divisions, plus the inevitability that the enemy had fewer and fewer replacements, the report continued, made it certain that before long he will utterly fail in his current attempt to withdraw and arrest his tactical reserve, so that he will be forced to commit at least part of his panzer army to the line. The report concluded, with continuing Allied pressure in the south and in the north, the breaking point may develop suddenly and without warning. The ideas, the opinions were Seibert's, based on his own beliefs and on Kenneth Strong's recent report stressing heavy German losses, but it was unfortunate, Seibert was to remark years later, that was the first report to be dressed up by Ingersoll. He stressed the optimistic picture, so it looked a lot better than it should. Whatever the case, G2 Summary Num 18 was to haunt Edwin Seibert for the rest of his life. In the offices of Schaeff's G2 section in the Trianon Palace Hotel at Versailles, General Strong was still optimistic because of the continuing high level of German attrition, yet he mentioned that until the 6th Panzer Army was committed, we cannot feel really satisfied. Noting continuing troop movements in the Eifel, he remarked that the procession is not yet ended. Although Strong saw the troop movements in the Eifel as just that, a procession, troops passing through, he nevertheless joined those who were directing increased attention toward the Eifel and the Ardennes. For at least a fortnight before the German attack began, he called attention at morning briefings conducted by the Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Walter Bedell Smith, to 3 possible uses of the reserve panzer divisions. They could go to Russia, counter-attack an Allied penetration, or stage a relieving attack through the Ardennes. As was the custom, he presumably listed the possibilities in descending order of probability, and as General Smith was to recall, Strong also suggested that the relieving attack might be made in Alsace. It may have been Strong's growing concern that prompted General Eisenhower, as he motored through the Ardennes on December 7th on the way to a conference with Montgomery, to remark that the Allied command might be in for a nasty little Kasserine. It was definitely Strong's concern that prompted Bedell Smith to urge Strong to go to Luxembourg City and alert General Bradley. Strong made the visit during the first week of December, at the time when General Seibert was also beginning to look with some anxiety at German activity in the Eifel. Strong talked first with Seibert, then spent more than half an hour with Bradley, who told him that he was aware of the danger, but that he had earmarked certain divisions to move into the Ardennes area should the enemy attack there. If so, he told nobody else about it, and issued no directive. In any event, those at Bradley's headquarters in Luxembourg City looked on Kenneth Strong as a worrywart. Bradley had by that time already spoken again about the possibility of a German strike in the Ardennes with the commander on the ground, a reserve infantry officer and former dean of Louisiana State University, Troy Middleton. Bradley saw an attack in the Ardennes as only a remote possibility, at most a spoiling attack involving 4 to 6 divisions. If it should happen, Middleton was to make a fighting withdrawal, all the way back to the Meuse River if necessary. Middleton never told his division commanders that. He was to locate no major gasoline or supply depots within the area to be given up. As Middleton withdrew, Bradley was to order armoured divisions to hit the enemy's flanks. Bradley never alerted any division to that role. If Middleton continued to harbour any particular concern, it could hardly have been as a result of any warning from his intelligence officer, Cole Andrew R. Reeves. In a report on December 9th, Reeves estimated the enemy opposite the 8th Corps to consist of 4 infantry divisions with a total strength of 24,000 men. That, if correct, meant that the enemy's line was almost half as thin as that of the widely stretched 8th Corps. The enemy's present practice, wrote Reeves, of bringing new divisions to receive front-line experience and then relieving them out for commitment elsewhere, indicates his desire to have this sector of the front remain quiet and inactive. Both Reeves and Middleton could, of course, read the intelligence reports sent down from higher echelons, and they must have remarked the difference in tone between that from Dixon of the 1st Army on December 10th and that from Seibert of the 12th Army Group on the 12th. In any event, it was obvious that higher command expected nothing to happen on the front of the 8th Corps, for Middleton received an order, as a corollary of the attack by the 1st Army, to seize the ROER River dams, to stage a feint near his southern boundary in Luxembourg in hope of drawing enemy strength from the north.